welcome back to Forgotten Hollywood. In this age of remakes, reboots, and redos, it's easy to compare the success or failure of past and present versions of the same film. Usually, this is done with an inflation calculator. But here are 3 reasons why that doesn't usually come close to telling the whole story. The first is the cost of a ticket. If you want to see the latest superhero movie, it will cost you about $10.53, give or take, depending on where you live and the theater you attend. However, back in 1920, the ticket price for the very first movie about a masked hero fighting evil averaged out to just 7 cents. Now, you might think that inflation would even that out, but the cost to go to the movies has gone up disproportionately with the value of the dollar. If tickets today cost the same in value as those in 1920, you would have to shell out a whopping $1.20 to see Blue Beetle. That's around a tenth of what it actually costs. Why do movies cost so much more now than they did back then? Well, budget is a very big reason. Well, I couldn't find the reported budget for the 1920 Mark of Zorro. I did find out how much it cost to remake it in 1940. $1 million, or the equivalent of $21.9 million today. At the time, a ticket cost an average of 24 cents, which is $5.26 today. In 1998, Antonio Banderas put on the mask and brought the hero back to theaters for $95 million, or $178.9 million today. The average ticket cost that year was $4.69, or $8.83 today. If they were to make a Zorro movie now, and I'm definitely not encouraging them to do so, as they would probably ruin it, the budget would likely run upwards of $200 million. This is not just because of the cost of special effects, as no version of Zorro I've seen has needed much in the way of CGI or pyrotechnics. Okay, maybe a few scenes in the Antonio Banderas version, but that's it. Now, this has more to do with the cost of production. The recent strikes have revealed how much actors and writers are wanting for their pay and residuals. And that's not even taking into account camera operators, lighting, costumes, makeup, hairstyles, prop, caterers, animal trainers, and everyone else who works on a movie set. No wonder a big budget movie costs upwards of $300 million. They need half of that just to pay for the cast and crew. The second reason for the higher box office take these days is the theaters that are counted. Staying with the previous example, in the 1920s, there were 15,000 movie theaters in America. By 1940, that number had increased to 17,500. By 1998, that number had dropped to just over 7,400. This might confuse you, but you have to take into account the number of screens offered in each movie theater. Until the early 1960s, every movie theater in the US had only 1 screen. In 1963, a theater opened that had 2 screens, doubling the profit. This was standard up until around the 1980s, with most theaters keeping a single screen and a handful having 2 or more. Today, the largest theaters in the US have more than 20 screens, with a few going as high as 30. In other words, you can show more movies now in a single day than were shown over the course of a week in 1920. Another factor that ties into this, as far as modern box office goes, is the location of the theaters. In the 1980s, Canada was combined to the US into a single movie region. So, when they talk about domestic numbers for Cinderella 2015, they mean the United States, Canada, and I believe Puerto Rico. When you look at the domestic numbers for the animated Cinderella in 1950, it's probably just talking about the United States. Does this add a huge number of theaters? No, just over 500. But in terms of ticket sales, even a few hundred theaters can help. The third reason for the inflated box office concern what numbers are reported. I have seen many an article praising movies for their success, for their high box office take, and conveniently ignoring things like budget, marketing, distribution costs, and such. A great example of this is The Little Mermaid, which came out earlier this year. With a reported budget of $265.5 million, bringing in almost $570 million. Sounds like they did really good! Until you consider the fact that they needed more than $6 million to break even. Numbers like these are used to make movies and studios look good and hide losses behind a smile. For the first half of Hollywood's history, success was measured by movie rentals. I don't mean this kind, but how much the studio was paid by the theater to have the film. When I first learned about this practice, I imagined it was some kind of flat rate like when you rent a car or a house. But no, this rental fee was a percentage of ticket sales, which makes sense, and it's just like studios get today. In this case, it was around 30 or 40%, which means that the numbers reported were gross sales minus distribution costs, which gives a much better idea of how much profit the film made rather than all the money before any extra costs are taken out. For example, let's look back at Disney's first animated film, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. It was released in 1937 with an estimated budget of $1.5 million, or $31.9 million today. And it brought in a domestic box office rental take of $4.2 million, adjusted to $89.5 million today. However, if we consider that that number is only a third of the gross box office take, the number that would be reported by today's standards would be $12.6 million, or $268.6 million. Now, if we were to take that number and adjust it for the average ticket price at the time of 25 cents and bring that up to the average price today of $10.53, the box office numbers for this film shoot up to $11.3 billion. Of course, this probably averages to only about a dozen showings a week, give or take a few. So if you factor in that this film would be screened at least 10 times that amount, well, now you see why inflation is only one factor when adjusting box office numbers. To summarize, there are a lot of things to consider if you want to determine how successful a movie is. Just looking at starting budget and box office is not going to tell you everything these days. However, back when numbers were measured by box office rentals over gross, it was a good indicator. In short, there's really no way to know exactly how much movies of the past would have made by today's numbers, but when you take all the factors into account, you can get a pretty good idea. Thanks for watching. What are your thoughts on the modern box office? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe. Click that bell for notifications, and I will catch up with you next time.